My name is Xiao. I'm from Perpetual Protocol, and today we're going to talk about the funding mechanisms of perpetual contract. So this is the outline of today. I'll start with the basics of funding, and then dive into the two different genres of funding mechanisms, which is periodic and block-based funding. And lastly, a little bit implementation, but there won't be code, just some easy math. And finally, the Q&A section. So my name is Xiao, or you can call me TSK, that's my Discord handle. So I've been a smart contract engineer at Perpetual Protocol for about 2.5 years, which is not really that long, but also long enough to partake in like some of the greatest events in crypto, for example, like FTX. So I call myself a veteran for surviving that and also just taking a piss out of myself, out of that misery. And you can also find me on Medium and GitHub. I sometimes write some crypto-related articles on my Medium and also other things. Okay, so let's start with the basics. So I believe most of you have used perpetual contracts. So however, maybe some of you don't know what perpetual contract is. So basically, perpetual contracts is like traditional futures, but it doesn't have an expiry. That's why it's called perpetual. However, because it's perpetual, it kind of needs a similar function as the expiry from the traditional futures, and funding is this mechanism. So it can be seen as a regular settlement schedule. So for example, on Binance, there will be 3 funding events a day, meaning that every 8 hours, users will be paying or receiving fundings on Binance. So funding is the regular settlement mechanism of perpetual contracts. And it can also be seen as a reward or cost for holding positions. So, because on derivative products, people can go long and short on these perpetual contracts. So funding is also the mechanism to try to reward or try to charge people from holding their positions. And also, therefore, it has the mechanism to align the two prices on a derivative exchange, which is the perpetual price, the price that users are trading on these perpetual exchanges, and also the underlying assets price. So for example, this is a screenshot from our exchange that the BTC perpetual market has 2 prices. The first one is the real-time price that is traded by users on our perpetual protocol V2. And there's another price, which is not really clear here. It's called index price. It's the underlying assets price, for example, on Uniswap. And in our case, it's from Chainlink. So you can see there's a price difference between those two. And funding mechanism is the mechanism to draw closer those two. Because theoretically, these 2 prices should be really close so that users won't be paying extra on these derivative exchanges. And before we dive into how we define funding, let's first quickly go through funding rate and funding payment. So funding rate is the level of deviation of those 2 prices. So funding rate describes the percentage of the difference between those 2 prices. And funding payment is the corresponding payment to funding rate based on a user's position size. So you can imagine that if a user has 10 BTC long positions, then he or she should be paying 10 times funding payment than those holding only 1 BTC long positions. Yeah, that is logical. And a really easy a really catchy one-liner is to remember how funding rate works is if funding rate is positive, then long position holders are going to pay short position holders. And vice versa, if funding rate is negative, then short position holders is going to pay long position holders. And we will define when funding rate is positive and negative in the next slide. But it's worth noting that these funding payments only occur between traders. So exchange should have been taking a cut from this funding settlement unless the exchange itself holds a long or short position. Otherwise, this payment only happen between traders. Okay, so In order to understand how funding is calculated, we first have to introduce the premium. And premium is pretty easy. It's just two prices, the difference between two prices. And the first one we call a market price. And market price is the price that is trading on a derivative exchange. In the previous example, here, it's list price. So we call this price, the price on a derivative exchange, the market price. And this is the index price. As I said, it's the spot prices of this BTC on other spot exchanges. So premium is just the difference between those two prices. So, and this premium is also defined as the funding payment a day per position size. So if we imagine that there's a user having one long BTC position, then the premium is the amount of money he or she has to pay a day because he or she is holding that one BTC position. So these are the definition. So if you look at an example, if the ETH market price is 1,100 and index price is 1,000, then the premium is 100. That means the cost of holding this position, one ETH position, is 100 a day. So this is called premium. And if we define funding rate is actually just the degree of deviation of market price from index price. So premium is market price minus index price. So funding rate only describes how deviated market price is from the index price. So if we're using the same example, then it's actually 10%. So these are actually quite simple. And as I mentioned earlier, if there's a positive funding rate, then that means long position holders are paying short position holders. And the reason why there's a positive funding rate is because there's a positive premium. And the reason is the market price is higher than index price. That means users on a derivative exchange is actually optimistic about future prices. That's why they are trading above the index price. They're trading at a higher price than spot exchanges. That's why there's a positive premium and low positive funding rate. Yeah. So this is the full version of the previous little screenshot. On our exchange, we listed the funding rate of the past 8 hours. But this doesn't have a lot of meaning. So we can see that in this situation, there's a positive funding rate over the last 8 hours, although the premium in this screenshot is actually negative. But because it's an aggregated version of 8 hours, so these two things don't necessarily align. Yeah. Okay. So we can take a look at the historical funding rate. This is data from Deribit. Deribit is also another exchange, and it's the data of BTC USDC perpetual market. So this is not the clearest, but I guess you can see there are some green bars here, and also several scattered red bars. And so green bars stand for positive funding rate, and red bars stand for negative funding rates. So as we might agree, that the last bull market is from the middle of 2020 to the end of 2022, around that time. So we can observe that during the bull market, the funding rates were mostly positive, which fits the previous definition of funding rate because, because there's a positive premium, because during a bull market, users were optimistic about the future prices, so they're willing to pay a positive funding rate, a positive funding payment to short position holders. And that's why there's a consistent positive funding rate. And after 2022, we could observe several negative funding rates, and this means that users were more pessimistic about the future prices, and those that are willing to short positions even though they are actually paying funding rate to long positions holders in the bear market. And so as we might recall, that a month before, it was the USDC ZPEC event, and this is also where I shorted. So if you also lost money from the USDC DPEG event, not because of the depegging itself, but because your hands felt itchy and you did something on a derivative exchange, then you're not alone, because I'm part of you. Yeah. Okay, so now we get into the two genres of funding mechanisms implementation. Okay. So I mentioned before that premium is the funding payment a day, but a day is quite long, right? Because there are like day traders. So depending on how the funding is implemented, how often the funding payments are settled, I'd categorize them into two genres. The first one is periodic. For example, like Binance, it's every 8 hours. So I'm actually not sure because I haven't traded on it for a long time. So I guess it's 8 a.m., 4 p.m., and 12 a.m. So every 8 hours, traders on Binance will be paying fundings or receiving fundings, or the defunct FTX. They used to be, I remember, once per hour. So I'd call them periodic funding mechanism. And on our Perpetual Protocol v2, or the previous data deribit, I'd call them either block-based or continuous funding event. So the reason why there are two terms is because I guess most people use continuous, though it's not necessarily the case, but we do use it as block-based because we are a decentralized exchange, so we kind of want to call it using a more blockchain generic term, because blockchain block. So the funding is updated at every block, and those we call it block-based funding. Yeah. So actually, there aren't such a big difference. The difference is merely the granularity of settlement frequency. So we can imagine that every 8 hours, that means it's 60 times 60 times 8, which is a big number. So the funding frequency of Binance and FTX is many seconds, while on Deribit, it might be every second, and on Perpetual Protocol v2, it might be every 12 seconds. So the difference is actually just the granularity of it. However, this difference actually leads to some of the pros and cons of these two genres. So here's an example of the screenshot of two mechanisms. So we can observe that most of the things are same. However, there's a difference. I don't know if you can see or not. There's a countdown. So they both have funding, but there's an extra countdown on Binance, and that means until the next funding event, it will be another 6 hours and 24 minutes. However, there's no such thing on Perpetual Protocol v2 because it's a block-based funding mechanism, because there's the funding on Perpetual Protocol v2 is settled every block. So it's kind of meaningless for us to show what is the expectation of next funding events, because first, the funding is really small. It's just the portion of 12 seconds out of a day. And yeah, that's the reason. Okay, so this is just a repetition of what I said previously. So on periodic funding exchanges, users only pay or receive funding on the hour or at the time of settlement. And however, on continuous or block-based exchanges, funding is calculated every block or on every new trade. So there's actually not necessarily a loophole, but definitely a room for gaming the system on periodic funding exchange, is that users can actually avoid paying funding or rush to get into a position to receive funding at the last minute. So if now it's 7:59 in the morning, and I know that if by holding long positions I'll be getting funding, then I will want to get a long position and wait for 1 minute and receive the funding and then close it, as long as the transaction fee is low enough. So on periodic funding exchange, there is this little room for gaming the system or arbitraging. However, on a block-based funding exchange, it's not necessarily the case. At least we haven't observed any arbitraging against a funding of every 12 seconds yet. So I've made a little comparison of two mechanisms. I intentionally left the right-hand side empty so that the page won't look very messy. But you can imagine that the pros of periodic funding is the cons of block-based funding and vice versa. So we can focus mostly on the my left-hand side, your left-hand side too. Okay, so the first advantage of periodic funding is that it's the implementation of most exchanges. So it's mainstream, and that also means that if there are coders that arbitrage between different exchanges, then they're most likely to be arbitraging between periodic funding exchanges. So it's easier for them to integrate with another periodic funding exchange than a block-based funding exchange. So that is basically just the network effect of this adoption. And the second point is funding rates are more predictable. However, this predictable doesn't mean that users can predict the future easier on this exchange. There's no such thing. But rather, because as the screenshot suggests, on Binance or other periodic funding exchange, they do tell you the expected funding rate. Unlike us, it's the historical funding rate. So users can actually react to this expectation because that's where the room for arbitraging comes in. So being predictable means that users can react to these expected values easier, while on block-based funding exchange, we don't even demonstrate that value because it is kind of meaningless. And the third point is, since most transactions are going to happen on the hour, so we can expect that there are definitely more transactions happening on the hour, and those higher transaction fees, and also smaller price deviation between contract price and also index price. But we can only guarantee this on the hour, but there's no guarantee throughout the entire funding interval. For example, on Binance, that'd be 8 hours. Okay, so as for the cons of periodic, so the first disadvantage is that I think undoubtedly this is an extra concern for the traders, at least for non-arbitragers or human traders, because apart from deciding whether I should go long or short on a position, I also have to consider the time when I'm opening this position, when I'm closing this position, because imagine if it's like 7:59 in the morning, and after 1 minute, I will be charged of funding if I open a position right now. Then I definitely want to delay my decision by 2 minutes in order to avoid paying that funding. However, that means that this mechanism is actually making me factor in more things into my trading decision. So undoubtedly, it's an extra concern. However, the later part of this sentence is quite controversial. So I believe that periodic funding exchange is less profitable for human traders. And, but I'll explain it in the pros of block-based funding, so let's just leave it for now. Okay, so the second disadvantage of periodic funding is that it is not ideal to be implemented for Uniswap v3 style LPs. So some of you might be familiar with Uniswap v3 mechanisms. So in short, it means that LPs on Uniswap v3, they can provide liquidity to a customized range. So if the price gets into the customized range, then the balance between two assets, let's say it's an ETH and USDC pool, then the balance of those two tokens will fluctuate as long as the price stays in the range. However, once the price goes out of the range, then the asset balance remains untouched after the price goes out. So why is it unideal for periodic exchange to be building on top of Uniswap v3? And the reason is that, as we mentioned, for example, Binance charges funding every 8 hours. However, that means that for an LP, a potential scenario is that an LP has no position size from 12 a.m. to 7:59 a.m. So throughout the 7 hours and 59 minutes, the LP has 0 position. However, at the last minute, because there are arbitraging bars want to arbitrage for the funding event, and then the arbitraging bars drive the price into this LP range. So that means that the LP is actually paying funding at the last minute while he or she is not earning any fees during the previous 7 hours and 59 minutes. So that means that because periodic funding exchange, they have really thick granular of funding frequency. So it is quite inaccurate for Uniswap v3 styles LPs because the asset balance of layer 2 tokens can fluctuate every second, while they are kind of forced to charge for a larger portion of funding payments. And I only mention this is because Perpetual Protocol v2 are built on Uniswap v3, so it might not be a disadvantage for other exchanges, but it is the reason why we didn't adopt periodic funding in the first place when we were building our second version. And the last problem of periodic funding exchange is that it's also kind of controversial. I believe funding rates on periodic exchanges are less accurate because most of the transactions of these exchanges happen on the hour. Maybe not most, but there are definitely a lot of transactions happening because that is a time when arbitrageurs are sure to make some profit. So compared to block-based funding exchanges, traders will just trade throughout any time because they don't really have to care about funding. However, on periodic funding exchanges, they have to pay attention to the time. So it is kind of less indicative that all the transactions are not all, some transactions are happening on the hour instead of being spread out evenly throughout any time. So I believe that if people are using the funding rates charts from an exchange, it is better to be a block-based funding instead of periodic one. Okay, so lastly, there's only one thing left, which is a controversial which one is fairer for the retail users. And my answer is block-based funding or continuous funding is fairer for users. And the reason, this is like a logical deduction of mine, so you can disagree, but I guess the logic is kind of correct. So I guess we can all agree that derivative products are zero-sum games. So if one person is winning, then the other person is definitely losing. So I think we can categorize the rules on a derivative exchange into three groups of people. The first one is the exchange, and the second one is retail users, and the third one is, let's say, arbitrageurs, which means coders who run arbitraging bots, so they can trade at a higher speed, and they can also arbitrage for funding events. So if we first take out the exchange from this discussion, because ideally exchanges should be net positive, otherwise they won't be running the exchange. So we are not left with the arbitrageurs and retail users only. So if there are only two rules in this system, and also the only reason why they are arbitraging bots is because they're earning money, then that definitely means that they're earning money from retail users, because there are only two rules in the system. So yeah, this is just a logical deduction, but there's no evidence because there's not yet an exchange offering two mechanisms on the same market. So I doubt whether there can be any evidence showing this, but this is just my personal opinion. And a little shout out to my teammates, especially William, for helping me to produce this comparison table. Okay. So now we'll get into a little bit implementation of the funding mechanisms. It's actually very easy. So we'll start with some numerical examples. So here we have a list of time, funding rate, and index price. So at time 0, we're using timestamp here. So for example, it's timestamp 1,000, and the funding rate is 0.5%, and the index price, we call it I0. So we can imagine that if there's a user with a position size S, and the position is open between T0 and T3, then the funding payment should be S times the funding for the time between 1030 and 1000, and the funding for 1045 between 1030 and etc. So a little explanation for why we're multiplying index price here is because we want to get a fair value, fair position value of this position size. So for example, if it's ETH, then we have to, and the position size is 1, then that means the notional value of this position size is 1,000 or it's 1,200. We have to first guess the notional value of a position and then multiply it with the time, how long it lasts, and also the funding rate. Yeah. So this is the implementation of a funding mechanism of how to calculate funding payments. However, so actually, no matter whether it's a block-based funding exchange or it's a periodic funding exchange, they're actually not that different, because as I said, the only difference is just the granularity of it. So you can imagine that on Binance, this time difference can be 8 hours, and on our exchange, this time difference can be 12 seconds or 20 seconds. But the only difference is just the value difference of this timestamp difference. And I think some of you are engineers, and as an engineer, we always know that we have to avoid running loops all the time. So whenever there's a chance to reduce the complexity, meaning not using loops, then we have to do it, because it's a great boost for the efficiency of the code. So instead of running loops for every users that have open positions over a long period, we shouldn't be running loops, but instead we should be storing a global cumulative value. So for example, let's define the cumulative value at time 0 is 0. And if it's at time 1, we add the difference of the timestamp multiplied by the funding rate and the index price. And for time 2, it's actually the global cumulative value at time 1 plus the extra numbers here. So this form actually looks very similar to the things on the right-hand side. So what we are trying to do is to replace the right-hand side with global cumulative values. No, sorry. And then we can actually define funding payment as position size multiplied by the global cumulative value at time closed minus global cumulative value at time open. And this open and close describe the behavior of a position. So in the previous case, it's actually the position size multiplied by the difference between the global cumulative values between T3 and T0. So we can also see that this is exactly the global cumulative value at time 3. And the only reason why we are lacking the global cumulative value at time 0 is because it's 0 in this case. So we can actually simplify the funding payment implementation into only a multiplication and a subtraction. And we also need some update rules for this mechanism. And so first, of course, we have to store those cumulative values. We have to always store those cumulative values. And the update rule of least value is that whenever a user takes action, meaning opening a position, closing, increasing the position size, we have to first settle the existing funding payment of that user. So I have to settle their funding payment to 0 because they want to update the position size. So we have to first settle the funding payments of that position size. And then we can update the new position size and the new global cumulative value. Because remember that here, we always need the global cumulative value when the position is open or updated. So this is how we implement a funding mechanism. Yep. So this applies to both. Okay, this is a mathematical form, but it's not really that important. However, as I mentioned, in the comparison table of two approaches, I mentioned that periodic funding is actually not ideal for exchanges that are built on top of Uniswap v3. So though this is not a Perpetual Protocol v2 workshop, so I'm just trying to describe some of the challenges we got into when we were building the funding mechanism on top of Uniswap v3. So I'm not going to repeat them. I'm just going to stay in this slide for a while. And if you're interested in the answers to these challenges, you're welcome to come up to me or any of my team. And I've written an article explaining it, which is the first URL. And I'll be handing out a slide later. So if you're interested, you can take a look at these articles. And so actually, this talk is actually the second URL in the PPT version. Yeah, and the third URL is the website by the teammate William. So you can check out the funding rates of many exchanges on his website. Okay, so now Q&A section. Is any?
Hi, thank you for the talk.
Hello.
So I'm from Diamond Protocol. We used to build a basis trading wall based on perp. What we found out, so that's about a year ago. So what we found out is the funding rate on perp is actually opposite direction to centralized exchanges. So I just want to ask you whether it's still going to be the case for V2.
So we actually talk about this internally, and we believe the reason is that the trading fee on our exchange is generally higher than other centralized exchanges, because usually they have like VIP programs where, for example, if you buy BNB, then you can hire your VIP tier so that you can enjoy a lower taker fee. For example, I remember it's like 0.03% on Binance on taker's fee. So we believe that the reason why there's like a larger price deviation and also opposite side of funding, and the reason is that we generally have a higher trading fee. So arbitraging bots are less willing to trade on our platform and to draw closer the prices. So that is our current conclusion. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
So what we currently build is actually on Uniswap v3. A leverage liquidity platform, so people can avoid being short squeeze or long squeeze using traditional derivatives. So for V2, per V2, my question is, do you guys see less chances of traders getting squeezed around a specific time?
Sorry, can you repeat? Do we see?
Do you see? So will there be less possibility for a trader to be squeezed, short squeeze or long squeeze around a specific time? Especially just before the funding rate.
I think I'm unable to answer this question, but we can discuss it private later.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
sure.
sorry about that.
No problem.
Hello. I just wondering if the funding rate can be predictable, or the formula is used old data.
To be predictable, do you mean generally?
The funding rate.
Yeah, can we predict the future? Because funding rate is kind of the future, right?
So the data is predict.
The data, which data, sorry, do you mean?
The funding rate formula.
The funding rate formula.
The number is predict or use old.
Oh, okay. So it's not predicted. The I think it depends on the two genres of funding implementation. Let me find it. So are you describing this one, whether it's predictable on Perpetual Protocol v2?
Yes, but I see the for example, the example is calculate the time from T0 to T3.
Yeah.
So the funding rate like 0.5 percentage. This number is predictable.
No, it's calculated because funding, the formula is premium divided by index price, right? So as long as we have the premium at time 2 or time 3, then we can get the premium. And as long as we have the index price, we can calculate the funding rate. So these funding rates are all calculated. For example, this 0.3% is calculated using the data between T2 and T3. And this 0.3% is also calculated using the data between these two. So these are all calculated.
So this is all happened.
Yeah, these are all happened.
Okay.
We are looking at maybe T100.
Oh, I understand.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
Okay, let's round of applause for Xiao again.
Thank you.
And then